Okay, then I think we can start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Markets Act, Perspective from the European Media Sector, an event organized by News Media Europe, a trade association representing news publishers in the EU. I'm Luca Bertuzzi, Digital and Media Editor at Euractiv, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel discussion. It is no secret that digital technologies have changed the way we communicate and perceive the world. However, what is less obvious is the way they changed how the media industry operates. Many adults in Europe nowadays get informed mostly or even uniquely online through social media or search engines. Online media have taken over the printed press in terms of readership, a trend that is unlikely to change in the future. The digital transition, however, has not been painless for the media sector. In fact, the shift to a digital environment has brought an existential crisis for many publishers, as they saw a dramatic drop in advertising revenues and a large part of their readership not prepared to pay for content. In other words, news outlets have had to more or less successfully reinvent themselves and their business model in a way that was sustainable for the new digital setting. And this is a struggle that many publishers are still facing right now. One of the key reasons for this crisis is that news outlets rely on online platforms to distribute their content, but these platforms in turn take most of their revenue. In spite of the fact that the retribution of news content has been regulated by the Copyright Directive, in the few countries that have transposed the directive, the online platforms have been able to cherry-pick the media outlets that can access their services, cutting favorable terms and leaving part of the media sector out, usually the smaller actors. These platforms are able to impose take it or leave it terms because they have become so large, they effectively control entire sectors of the economy and therefore can determine the access to millions or even billions of users. In one word, they have become gatekeepers, the key concept of the Digital Markets Act. The DMA is based on the assumption that competition in the digital space moves so quickly it requires specific provisions that go beyond the general EU antitrust law. Although the scope is still a moving target, the objective is to regulate very large online platforms. These have become the largest corporations in the world, with a market capitalization comparable or even higher than the GDP of many developed countries. Under the DMA, gatekeeper platforms will have to fulfill specific obligations, the nature and extent of which is still a matter of discussion in the European Parliament and European Council as co-legislators. The hopes are high in the media sector that the DMA will rebalance the bargaining position of publishers vis-à-vis these tech giants, helping them to make their business model more sustainable. A strong and plural media sector is not just good news for publishers, but it is also a necessary precondition for the well-functioning of a democratic society, as recognized in the European Commission's Democracy Action Plan. So for today's discussion, I'm happy to welcome the following speakers. MEP Stéphanie Yancourtin from Renew Europe is the DMA rapporteur for the Econ Committee. Other than a lawmaker, Yancourtin is a lawyer with a direct experience in the French Competition Authority. MEP Mars Colaya, a part member of the Green Group, is a DMA shadow rapporteur in the IMCO Committee. MEP Colaya is also a software engineer and an activist. MEP Tomasz Frankowski from the EPP Group is a shadow rapporteur for the CULT Committee. He unfortunately had a last-minute commitment, but will be joining us via video message. Last but not least, Wout van Wack, Executive Director of News Media Europe, will also contribute to the discussion. Each speaker will start by giving an opening statement of around 5 minutes. We'll then move to a roundtable discussion with some follow-up questions. We'll try to keep the answers concise so to make the discussion dynamic. In the last part of the webinar, we will open the floor to questions from attendees. You can ask your question in the chat at any time during the event, and we will make sure to answer as many as possible. So without further ado, I'll now leave the floor to MEP Yancourtin. for the opening statement. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I'm delighted to be here to discuss the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, which is, I believe, with the Digital Services Act, crucial for the European media sector, and the European Union will set ambitious rules for the online world, and we very much welcome those two texts, and we want them, of course, at the European Parliament to be ambitious. And the power of some countries, as you said, has grown so much that have become more powerful than member states themselves. A handful of companies can set their own rules on the online world and decide who enters the market and what consumers can see online. So clearly these companies act as gatekeepers in digital markets. And I think it's time to reverse the trend and address the bargaining power these large online platforms have. And let's be honest, I definitely think the European Union is paving the way with this ex-ante regulation, and for once, nobody will blame the EU for over-regulating. Some other important jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, the United States, South Korea, and even China, are trying to address the power of these gatekeepers and the consequences on digital markets. The Digital Markets Act could be a real game changer, as the traditional competition policy approach tends to be very difficult and obviously too slow in a digital world to be implemented on time. The DMA will establish rules stating the interdictions and the obligation for platforms acting as gatekeepers. So the DMA, I believe, could be very much important for the media sector, as we are not only talking about millions of euros, but also about survival of the media sector, of media pluralism and quality of information. Well, if you allow, let me briefly introduce my 3 priorities in this regard. My first priority is the scope, which is essential to determine the efficiency of the regulation. I believe it is essential to keep the scope of application limited to online platforms acting as gatekeepers, and for which the past and ongoing investigation have proven the current problems, which are not adequately addressed by the current competition law. I'm therefore in favor of the threshold proposed by the Commission. However, I would like to underline the conglomerate strategy of companies as a qualitative criterion of being a gatekeeper. The problem with these gatekeepers is not their market share, but the whole ecosystem they built and in which they lock business users and consumers. One other addition concerning the scope I am pushing for in the Econ report regarding the scope is the addition of web browsers and virtual assistants to the core platform services. I think it must be addressed so obligations can also apply definitely to these services. Competition law will still apply to specific markets with companies abusing their dominant position in complement to this tool. So the objective of the DMA goes beyond that. This is for my first priority, the scope. The second priority is the list of obligations and interdictions, which I believe are at the heart of this regulation. They have to be targeted, but future-proof at the same time. They have to be ambitious, but also enforceable. And the list drawn up by the European Commission will already bring about, I think, substantial changes if Articles 5 and 6 are properly enforced. However, I'd like to improve this list to cover all harmful practices of gatekeepers. I think we have to avoid loopholes from the beginning. Let's avoid having to review this regulation every year, because this tool is dedicated to last for at least the 2 following decades. And to cite a few obligations and interdictions, I would like to allow business users to offer their product through their own sales channel. To communicate with their users, I would like to ban services installed by default by gatekeepers, and I'm in favor also of extending the non-discrimination clause to all essential platform services and not only to the app stores. This will concern the media sector when it comes to online advertising or ranking. And I think non-discriminatory access must be extended to all core platform services. So basically every access condition can easily be converted into a treatment condition with the same unfair and non-discriminatory effect, so that the DMA must also close this possible loophole in the article. In this article, third priority, it leads me to this very crucial point also, which is enforcement, because you can have a very good regulation, but if you cannot enforce it, then it means nothing really. And this is not, I mean, this is no point having the best ever in the paper. So we have seen it with the copyright directive and the neighboring rights. If you do not have the means to enforce properly, that's the case, there will be no substantial change. Enforcement and governance are the central point, I think, of this regulation, and far from wanting to create a new entity or new mechanism, I think we need to capitalize on what already exists, and above all, we must be ready and operational when the regulation comes into force tomorrow. First, I'd like to remind you that the implementation of this regulation must be done exclusively at the European level to avoid any risk of fragmentation and regulatory shopping by gatekeepers. However, the Commission and its 80 new staff dedicated staff will not be sufficient to supervise the gatekeepers, to implement the regulation, and to ensure an effective follow-up. This is why I would like to clarify the role of the National Competition Authority, and in particular via the European Competition Network, which can, I think, provide considerable support and valuable help to the Commission in terms of sharing information, expertise, and resources. And finally, I want us to show our teeth and not to be afraid to bite. Our antitrust toolbox is very complete, but we have not yet fully explained it and exploited it sufficiently. And I think we have to, in this area, we have to create or to enforce two things which are very important if we want to have these two applicable. The role of stakeholders for me is very key, and without opening the door to procedures that would be open-ended and bureaucratic, stakeholders directly impacted by gatekeepers must be able to take part in a dialogue to decide on the measures to be implemented by gatekeepers to comply with this obligation. And these remedies should be market tested with stakeholders to ensure their effectiveness. These stakeholders must also be able to provide feedback to the Commission, including through national authorities. And the second priority here is the compliance with the new rules, which cannot be a one-shot deal, you know, and then it's over, because digital markets are constantly evolving and we have to scrutinize them all the time. And I would like to see gatekeepers take on the financial burden of an independent compliance officer who would be appointed by the European Commission and who would have access to the gatekeepers' confidential data, such as its algorithm, to assess its day-to-day compliance and the potential need to revise the measures in place. So these are preliminary remarks, and so I'm sure we'll have a follow-up discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, MEP. We will now pass to MEP Colaya. Please, let's keep the opening statement to 5, maximum 7 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. At the start, maybe I would like to mention that activism is not my current activity. That was my past before I became a politician, but I think that is probably clear. Thank you for inviting me to this extremely important debate on the Digital Markets Act, which I would say is one of the most crucial pieces of legislation in this term. Given that the topic is focused on media, let me start with saying that media freedom and freedom of expression and access to information are of utmost importance for my political group. And these rights are central to a democratic society. I'm coming from Central Europe, and we have been observing for the past few years attempts of Mr. Orban, Babiš, or Kaczynski to paralyze free press, to completely destroy media pluralism by buying main newspaper publishers, or by channeling funds from state advertisements to pro-government journals. We have seen serious attempts to censor freedom of speech, such as the Hungarian law against disinformation during the COVID pandemic, which aimed at silencing journalists, criticizing the governmental crisis response, etc. So we are fully aware of many challenges that the media face and how important it is for keeping our democracy. My group tabled several amendments in both IMCO and CULT committees to support media and media freedom. Our general approach was to limit the digital gatekeepers' unfair practices on the market and to help European companies to challenge them. Therefore, we speeded up the procedures for assessment for the Commission. We made sure that procedural safeguards are introduced so that it's not possible to escape obligations. And we improved obligations under Articles 5 and 6. So more specifically, with the help of the Digital Markets Act, we have the opportunity to ensure that major gatekeepers are not imposing their own conditions on press publishers that are unfair. That publishers can have more control over their own content and service. So the DMA creates a transparency over advertising revenues. It creates the possibility to inform users via the newspaper apps about cheaper subscription options on their own website and continue to use the App Store as well. It creates the possibility to offer access to content on different platform under different conditions, like for instance, setting a different fee and a different distribution channels. It eliminates the mandatory in-app payment system and high commission fees for in-app purchases. And in our amendments, we also included browsers and virtual assistants. And I fully agree that users should be empowered to uninstall unnecessary pre-installed apps on their devices. And I also agree with the type of enforcement that it is an EU type of enforcement with a support from national competent authorities. So this is how I envision that in principle the Digital Markets Act should look like. This is what it should bring. Also, maybe anticipating a bit topic of targeted advertising in this debate. Let me say that my group is especially mindful of the privacy and protection of data of individuals. And micro-targeting involves extensive collection and processing of personal data. And the majority of players in this sector are big data firms on which smaller players are heavily dependent on. So proposing transparency measures alone will not help to break this power. If we want to create equal opportunity for smaller companies as well, we have to create this in a way that we don't draw the line at the worst level. So as legislators, we are obliged to look at the big picture and make sure that we include all aspects in the policy making, including, what is the impact of targeted advertising on democracy itself. I also need to emphasize that this doesn't mean that other types of advertising practices wouldn't be allowed anymore. Less intrusive practices such as contextual advertising based on keywords, targeting on specific web pages, etc., would still remain available. And actually, the EDP, the European Data Protection Supervisor opinion, supported a phase out of targeted advertising, leading to a final prohibition of it on the basis of pervasive tracking. So that would be probably the end of my introductory statement. If there are any questions, I think we can address them. And I think that I am kind of like on the 7 minutes, right?
Yes, you are indeed, and thank you very much for that. So before we take any question, we are gonna finish with the introductory statements. We now move to the video message from MEP Frankowski.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be able to share this video message with you today. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, I am unable to attend this webinar in person, but I still wish to share some reflection with you on the topic of the DMA, which is very important for the media sector. I am the shadow rapporteur on behalf of the EPP group in the Culture and Education Committee, and this will inform my remarks. In CULT, we look, of course, at the media sector with care, because it plays a uniquely important role in the development of European culture, education and democracy. The sustainability of Europe's media is a political priority, not only for many political groups, but also for the European Commission, as we see in the European Media Action Plan and the European Democracy Action Plan, which called for greater consistency across different policy areas to ensure sustainable media. In many ways, the media, but also the broader creative sector, is one of the best examples of a sector that is dependent on gatekeepers. The Internet has transformed the way European citizens access and they consume content, and very often this takes place through the core platform services of the gatekeepers. So, when gatekeepers impose conditions or restrictions on how content can be accessed, this raises not only economic questions for media sustainability, but also questions about freedom of expression, notably when it comes to media pluralism and artistic expression. This is why our work in CULT starts with efforts to clearly recognize the importance of protecting fundamental rights in the DMA proposal. In our view, it is clear that this should inform the logic of implementation and enforcement. While we are still working on compromise amendments in CULT, on which I expect there will be relatively good consensus across groups, I can talk about some of the important points that I'm confident will be reflected in our report. First, in terms of scope, we are very clearly supporting the inclusion of web browsers and voice assistants as core platform services, because of the high risk they pose for gatekeeping and market fairness when it comes to media. If we do not include these services, we risk that gatekeepers will simply shift their unfair conduct from other services to these. Second, we are seeking to make recommendations on a wide range of obligations that would affect the business models of the media sector, issues concerning access to data, advertising markets, rankings, fair and non-discriminatory access, ancillary services, and app stores. In fact, most of the obligations are relevant to the media. We cannot go into the detail of each of these issues, but allow me to elaborate on a few that I think deserve specific attention. The Commission's proposal contains a provision for fair and non-discriminatory access to app stores. We think this provision needs to cover all gatekeeper services because a general fairness clause is clearly needed. We currently have in the media sector very difficult negotiations between publishers and gatekeepers to implement the copyright directive. We notice many competition problems with the agreements gatekeepers seek to conclude, and there are the risks that need to be clearly addressed. It is not for gatekeepers to cherry-pick which media companies should benefit from the rights of intellectual property, and we must make sure that right holders across all the EU are fairly remunerated. This point is particularly important for the EPP group, which has championed the copyright reform in the previous mandate to make the framework for the digital age. There have been many proposals across different committees coming from the EPP on how to deal with the question of bargaining power and fair access. Some proposals being more far-reaching than others. What I can say at this stage is that the EPP is determined to see a successful implementation of the copyright directive and the publisher's right. The Commission's proposals on online advertising are also an important step forward in bringing transparency to advertising markets, and especially the opaque role of gatekeepers who dominate these markets. We cannot forget in CULT that advertising is the lifeblood of the media and the press sectors. It plays an extremely important role in funding European content, whether information, educational, cultural, or entertainment. And we need to make sure that media companies receive an appropriate share of advertising that is based on their content. We should not forget that platforms do not create content, but merely distribute it, so a just balance must be found. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Another very insightful contribution there. So now we move to the opening statement from votes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca, and good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone. Let me start by saying how grateful I am to our speakers and the audience for joining us today, as we all know that early September is a particularly busy time for everyone. So thank you for joining us. We felt it was important to host this webinar as there seems to be a tremendous interest of the industry concerning this Digital Markets Act, and many in the media sector have been calling for this kind of regulatory instrument for years. Fundamentally, a lot of media companies take issue with digital gatekeepers because they are able to exercise such strong control over how content reaches audiences in the online space. And this is true both in terms of the substance of the content, which is more a question of the Digital Services Act, but also in terms of the nature of the economic transaction, which is our focus in the Digital Markets Act. When gatekeepers control how content is monetized and how the economic transactions must take place, it raises all sorts of questions about fairness in the digital market space. And over the years, this has resulted in antitrust complaints spanning across various fields, like, for instance, the licensing of intellectual property, online advertising, access to data in app stores, and a number of others. One takeaway from all these cases is that there's often a sense of frustration and unfairness when it comes to doing business with these tech giants. And now many look up to the European Parliament for leadership on this important file. And this is why I'm so happy with the speakers that have joined us today. Now, I will not elaborate on all the policy asks from the news media sector here and now, but perhaps I can point to three important ones. Firstly, when it comes to scope, it is essential that we include voice assistants and browsers in the list of core platform services. And so I'm very glad that the reports that have emerged from the different committees in the European Parliament so far have taken this into consideration. And I think that Mr. Frankowski made a good point when he said that gatekeepers shift problematic conduct to other areas and core platform services. What we do not want is to waste years playing cat and mouse with these tech giants. Second, when it comes to fair access to these core platform services, a lot more can and should be done to facilitate a more sustainable digital ecosystem for high quality journalistic products and services. And it shouldn't be up to gatekeepers to discriminate between what content citizens should access or not. And it's also very important that all media are afforded fair terms of access. And I'm saying this as we've noticed issues with negotiations in, for instance, France and Germany and Australia. So here, the obligation in Article 6(1)(k) should not just cover app stores, but all core platform services, as was mentioned before as well. And thirdly, we need to consider how to ensure an effective procedural framework and enforcement. Does the European Commission need more sticks than just the obligations under Article 5 and 6? Are the procedural delays associated with decisions and market investigations not undermining market reality? And we need to think about we need to think that they need to be shortened. And one way to do this is to increase the pool of resources available to the European Commission by ensuring that they can also call in national competition authorities when this makes sense. Now, some questions that we feel are important and deserve reflection going forward. Is the European Commission's proposal sufficiently ambitious when it comes to platform services and obligations? What constitutes fair access to the services of a gatekeeper? And how can we make sure that the Digital Markets Act remains a dynamic, flexible, and future-proof tool which can tackle emerging and existing unfair practices, practices that are hampering a fair and sustainable market for high-quality journalism online, which remains, of course, vital for a healthy democracy. I'll stop here. Our full position can be accessed through our website, newsmediaeurope.eu. Thanks again for joining us this morning. And now, Luca, it's back to you.
Thank you very much, both. So before I open the floor for questions from attendees, I have a question myself to our guests. I will start with MEP Jan Courtin. Now, it is not our intention to go too much in depth with the copyright directive, as that has a long history and would deserve a panel discussion on its own. However, as we have been discussing until now, there is a strong relationship between the copyright directive and competition law, as the French case well illustrates. Following the transposition of the copyright directive in France, Google changed its display policy, only allow content from publishers that agree to provide it for free. The French media sector reacted by filing a complaint to the French competition authority, leading to a legal dispute we are still hearing about today. So, although some French media finally reached an agreement with Google at the beginning of this year, the French Minister of Culture said that the DMA is the opportunity to rebalance these bargaining conditions that are at the moment too favorable to online platforms. So I would like to hear from you that you have followed the case since the beginning, and you have a direct experience in the French Autorité de la Concurrence, even though it was before, of course, the beginning of this case. How can the DMA create fair bargaining conditions that it seems all the panelists here agree on, but how in practice would that work? And how can we make that even small regional or local media outlets can negotiate with the largest corporations in the world on fair terms?
Thank you. Well, as you rightly mentioned, Luca, the deadline to implement the directive was set on June 2021. And until then, only France and the Netherlands has fully implemented the neighboring right. We experienced with this French case you mentioned that having this right set in the legislation is a long road to go. The complaint from the media sector to the French Competition Authority is interesting in this regard, and the French Competition Authority imposed interim measures in order to negotiate in good faith, and Google and the media sector eventually managed to strike a framework agreement, but mostly to Google's condition. And this summer, the FCA has fined Google 500 million euros for not having negotiating in good faith. I think it's the biggest, in fact, the biggest ever fine imposed by the French Competition Authority for a company's failure to adhere to respect one of its rulings. As you may know, Google is now appealing this decision and has extended its deal with other publishers in the meantime. And so bottom line is it's not to companies to accept or not the law and to decide how to comply with it. So I think this has to be said, repeated again and again and again. And I don't want to, let's say, disappoint the media sector, as I know it's one of your requests, but even if I'm in favor of an arbitration and a strong one mechanism, I don't think that one arbitration mechanism within the DMA is a right way to go. I think first we must wait for the full implementation of the copyright directive, and I'm sure that the bold French ruling will become case law for the future. I think the DMA, however, will definitely contribute to address the bargaining power of big tech. First, it will force them to give access to non-aggregated and aggregated data. So Google will no longer be able to claim that no one of the online content provide value for its search engine. And I think also the DMA and DSA must allow the regulator to access to the black box of big tech acting as gatekeepers, basically their algorithm. So I think it's time to reverse the trend. And this is very important. It's not up to GAFA's algorithm to decide how markets are working.
Very clear, thank you. And I'll build on that for a question to MEP Colaya. MEP Jan Curtin was mentioning sharing of data. Media outlets have on their own ambition to become technological companies and launch their own services that might in the long run compete with these gatekeeper platforms. So to what extent do you think that data should be shared by these gatekeeper platforms, and what kind of data you think should be shared? Because this, as we well know, is a topic that is sensitive for the Green Group.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that, the aim should be to reduce the reliance on the gatekeepers, because, I mean, one thing is to make them to play by the rules, but the other thing is, do we really want to build a society that is so heavily dependent on these major players? Or do we rather want to build a society where the small ones don't have to be dependent on these big ones, because then we can see that regardless of the legislations, there are corner cases that happen over the time where the dominant position is somehow abused. That's only logical because these companies, of course, the only thing they care about by definition as a company is the profit. So they search for the way. So they search the ways how to make more money. So so that, I think, is the overarching principle of how we look at the things. The DMA creates an opportunity that data, and I already addressed that in my introductory speech, would be shared with the publishers, like, for instance, transparency over the advertising revenues, that they should also be able to look into the performance analysis of the advertisements. So these kind of things is what I believe will help, but we should not forget about the major goal, which is create the fairness on the market that leads to less dependence on these gatekeepers.
Okay, that's very clear. I think that also ties in with the campaign the Green Group is leading on banning targeted ads. Now, we also don't want this topic to monopolize the discussion, but the point is, how do you define targeted ads? And how do you define contextual ads? Which kind of data can be used? Should it be just the location and language of the user, or what is where do you draw the line there? And the related question to that is, don't you, some media outlets have voiced concern that a shift to contextual ads might lead to a drop in revenues? How do you conciliate the right to privacy with the right of freedom of expression that you said is very close to the core values of your political groups?
Yeah, thanks. I think you ended the question really well in a sense that basically it is our objective, or it must be our objective as legislators, to weigh in all possible aspects. And with targeted advertising, it's particularly difficult. It's a very difficult question. Now, the reason really is, on one hand, the privacy and protection of personal data, because the reason for strictly regulating targeted advertising leading to a phase out and a ban, because this cannot be done in any other way. If we speak about micro-targeting or behavioral advertising, that it cannot be done any other way than on a pervasive collection of personal data. So I think the aspect that we should take into account is we define it as when it's based on personal data, it should be banned. Now, the second aspect that is important is, what is the impact of micro-targeting to our democracy, because it allows targeting of people and spreading fake news in a really easy way. And in the long term, we would rather to see it as it's a major threat to the whole existence of media, I would say, because the purpose of media is to inform public. And maybe in different parts of Europe, the level of confidence of the public in media is different, but I've been observing, and I hope you confirm, unfortunately, I need to say, that the confidence is, going down, and that many people basically follow these information rabbit holes, I call them, or information bubbles that keep them close to conspiracy theories, for instance, and do not really look at information that is out of that particular bubble. And this is extremely dangerous. So we need to look at it also from this perspective. And this is also really, really, really harmful for media. When it comes to contextual advertising, there is not an issue like that. When it comes to the particular question about geolocation, I mean, like if it's a information that that can be, with that information can be linked to a particular individual, then it's by definition personal information, and that falls into our definition of the targeted advertising that should be banned. And finally, let me just a final note: we need to realize that targeted advertising basically puts all data in the gatekeepers' hands. In this particular case, Google. And the publishers become completely dependent on them. And we already know that Google tries to monopolize the market by dropping cookies and switching to flock and cohorts. And we need to weigh in on that viewpoint as well, because I don't think that we should make publishers completely dependent on them. And I realize that this is a very heated debate, but I also see that the publishers are not completely not completely on the same page with that, because, for instance, the CEO of Axel Springer, in a letter to the President von der Leyen, supported a ban on micro-targeted advertising. So, I mean, this is a very important debate, extremely important debate, and we have to weigh in all the aspects to have the good outcome.
Thank you. And let's put that debate on hold for now, or what you would like to intervene. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I do not want to drag this on any longer. I think we're on the same page when it comes to sort of ensuring an environment wherein news, the business of producing news basically is sustainable, and where European consumers can enjoy as many different news sources as possible. I think, however, that the reality of the sector is slightly more complicated and intricate than we often take for granted in discussions like these. Reality is that certain news outlets work really well on subscription-based models. Others work very well on advertising-based models, and so a ban of targeted advertising might do irreparable damage to the way that European consumers or parts of the news market basically that they would have access to. I'd just like to caution against sort of seeing it as a black and white debate, because I think the reality is much more complicated than just that.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, MEP Jan Kvartan, there is a question for you in the chat concerning the paper released by France, Germany, and the Netherlands yesterday on enforcement, calling for more tailor-made obligations. Would you be available to comment on these? And we have seen a similar paper some weeks ago that called for a stronger involvement of the national authorities in the enforcement process. Would you be supportive of this approach, or what is your stand here?
Yes, thank you. There are two points in your question, and well, I do share the idea of being able to update, as I said earlier, obligations and being agile with gatekeepers. I think that you know, my idea of having compliance officers depending on the European Commission could help in this way to make sure the compliance measures are fit for purpose. If we eventually need to add new practices, and I think we could still do a review of the regulation regularly with the European Parliament involved. But without taking too long on this proposal. Well, I'm not completely in favor of a new article that would introduce tailor-made remedies, as I think it could be seen as a case-by-case approach. It could take time, and DMA has been proposed to save time, and I think it could create a new competition law within the DMA. So I think it could add confusion where we need clarity and complementarity between DMA and competition law. So that's why I did not take on board this amendment, nor the rapporteur in IMCO. However, I do believe that we need to ensure, and Wout said it earlier, the future-proofness of these two by being able to update obligations in due time. So that's why we need some agility and flexibility. And regarding the paper on your second point, I'm very much in favor of on the new compromise of the Council, specifying the role of NCAs and the European Competition Network. I think it's something this is something I've been pushing for since the beginning, because I'm sure that European Competition Network provides for an excellent forum of work, even if the European Commission will be the sole enforcer, the pilot on the plane, it will need co-pilot. And these co-pilots are definitely national regulators. Within that, the leading role of the National Competition Authority will be key.
Thank you. I would like to stay with you with another question concerning the fact that in the current negotiations on the under the copyright directive between publishers and online platforms, publishers were not able to unite to form a coalition because of EU antitrust law that would see this as an uncompetitive cartel. Do you think that in specific circumstances, competition rules should be relaxed to allow collaboration between publishers?
Yeah, I saw this question, and I think it's a very good idea, and I think it's something we should analyze more carefully. This is another tool to exercise against gatekeepers and against their power, their superpower. It could well balance, you know, the dynamic at stake. And so I think this is very interesting. And actually, it reminds me of something I'm trying to analyze on the agricultural sector, you know, with all the producers and farmers being less powerful than the big distribution channels, and trying to make sure that the competition law could be more lenient with them when it comes to a partnership or agreements that could be excluded or exempted, at least, from Article 101 of the Treaty of the European Union. So yes, on principle, I think it would be a very good idea, and I think we should analyze this more carefully. And if I read correctly, it's a question from Kate Tay. And this person can be free to send me some more elements on that. I think it's a very, very good idea as well, and acts of making sure publishers have more power against gatekeepers online. Yeah.
Before we move to follow up in writing, I see what is nothing. Perhaps you would like to provide some insights from the media perspective on this.
Yeah, it's something that we as an association have been thinking about internally as well. So I'm nodding sort of in agreement, and I'm very happy that Ms. Joncourtin is thinking along the same lines as well.
Great. So now I will pick up one of the last questions concerning the fact that we see there is broad support in Parliament to extend the scope to voice assistants and browsers for obligations to the gatekeepers. Do you have the impression that this support is also present in the European Council? Have you been confronting with the European Council on this aspect, and do you think this will move forward in the direction the Parliament would want? I will start with Kolaya on this.
Thank you for the question. Well, yes, I'm in touch with, of course, my counterparts in the Czech Republic. However, I need to say that off the top of my head, I don't have an answer to this particular question because there were more, priorities of mine. So this particular one, I cannot really answer off the top of my head whether they supported it or not in our discussion. So I'm sorry, I cannot really, but maybe I can follow up if there is any way how I can do this.
MEP Joncourtin, would you like to add on this?
Yes, there's a broad support, especially following the latest result of market investigation from the European Commission on the Internet of Things, and we will start with a regulation, I think, with big loopholes if Siri or Alexa are not covered. So I think this has to be definitely covered. And I think, I mean, if we're talking about the Council and France, for example, because you know that France will host the presidency next year. Actually, yesterday we were talking about DMA with my Renew colleagues because we are now in Paris currently having a seminar with all the Renew group, and we discussed that with the minister, the French minister and its teams, and there doesn't seem to be a trouble with that. I mean, this is doesn't seem to be a problem, and of course it seems to be okay on this side. Broad support from France as well.
Okay, I'm sure many MEPs will be glad to hear that. One final question for MEP Kolaya concerning the transparency requirement you were mentioning earlier. An attendee is raising the question whether this transparency requirement should be extended to algorithms and content ranking. Would you be supportive of such an amendment?
Well, I am in full support of transparency in content ranking. And I would even go farther than that. I think that users should be able to opt out from the artificial intelligence, practically speaking, that basically orders content in their feeds. They should be able to also adjust how it works. And nevertheless, this is more of, if I remember correctly, this is more of a topic for the Digital Services Act, where the transparency of the recommender systems is already included in the Commission's proposal. So, of course, we will see further in the negotiations if we want to introduce anything like that for the Digital Markets Act. But on the other hand, I don't really see a reason of a duplication if the negotiations going in parallel but also closely linked would solve the issue already in one of the pieces of the legislation. So we will see, but with the idea how to implement it, but with the idea, I fully agree.
Thank you very much. So I think this concludes this session. To sum up, we have seen the potential implications of the DMA for the media sectors in all its aspects: access to data, advertising, and core platform services. The main point from the publisher side is the huge imbalance they face when bargaining with online platforms, an imbalance that they hope the DMA will mitigate. The policy discussion is, of course, still open and ongoing in the Council and the Parliament, and we hope you find this panel discussion interesting and that it provided insights for policymakers in Brussels and abroad. Thank you very much for joining and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.